May I introduce my department? It's just like Brett Williams. Yeah, so my third one will be yes, so fun fact, friends, yeah, myself and I actually at different times, but like no, alkaline. Yeah. Right. What are you going to say? And then I won't have to help you with oh, good. Okay, that's fine. Again, that's right. All right. How are we doing our time? That's correct.
Yeah.
Or 3:30? Thanks.
안녕하세요. 안녕하세요. 네, 경찰입니다. 잘하셨어요. 네, 반갑습니다.
I thought you might have some things in common.
Yeah, so, yeah,
I was also just telling Lynn that we all graduated from the summer. Wait, that's different from me.
Oh, yeah.
Then I came to the day before a postdoc rejection.
There are also groups that are not, incredibly productive in the house.
Okay, are you available right after this? Okay, because I'm gonna have to run straight to teach my class. At 4:30, but Lynn Tuesday for a few minutes, and then there's a postdoc. Visiting hotel, and I was gonna have Cole bring them back to the hotel, but I don't have to leave it.
Yeah, I can, I'll get through this with opportunity and stuff. Okay. So, yeah.
Okay, I thought we should get this started. All right, welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I think I know everyone in the room, but just in case, I'm Brandy Toner. And it's my pleasure to introduce the seminar speaker today. This is Dr. Kyounglim Kang. She goes by Lynn. Like to use her first name. So Lynn comes to us by way of a PhD at the University of Vienna in Austria with Professor Stefan Kramer. And then she came here to the US and worked in California at UC Davis with Jackie Pena, Professor Jackie Pena, working on metals in wildfire affected soils and metal contamination in groundwater and other things, but that's a highlight. And then she recently joined the University of Minnesota in this pretty unique joint affiliation with our department and CFANS and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So there's a Department of Energy User facility there called the Advanced Light Source. And so Lim is here in our vocabulary, research professional of 6. And at the ALS, she's a beamline affiliate. So in case you're going to learn a little bit about the work that she does at the Advanced Light Source, but it's a neat, unique hybrid, I would say, appointment in that she does her own research and also facilitates the research of others through NSF-funded units. And I'll also say that she lives and works in California full-time. And then also Edwin is a postdoc from also who lives and works full-time in California. He's also visiting this week. So I'll turn it over to him.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to meet you all. And thank you for having me in this seminar. I'm very excited about sharing my research and experience. So my name is Kyounglim Kang, and as currently introduced, I go by Lim. And today I'm going to talk about wildfire produces crystalline iron and manganese species, which is not typical the species in the surface soil. And I'm going to talk about the use of the multimodal synchrotron X-ray imaging and spectroscopy techniques. Before I go into the topic, I first want to introduce myself and the program where I am at. So I am a researcher 6 position at the University of Minnesota, but also the STXM beamline scientist at ALX in the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So what is this? This is synchrotron Earth and Environmental Science Consortium that is funded by NSF. The goal of the STIS is to advance research and education in the synchrotron-based Earth and environmental science. And above that, the STIS is supporting the environmental science from the almost everything from the Earth, from the atmosphere to all the way down to the core of the Earth system. Also expands to the planetary system. Beyond pursuing the science objectives, this is also responsible for management, operation, and development of the multiple user facility, which is a different types of beamlines that is hosted by 4 DOE operated US synchrotron, which include advanced light source, where I am stationed at, and advanced photon source, as well as National Synchrotron Light Source, also the Stanford Synchrotron Light Source. So one of the facilities that the STIS is supporting is the sister beamline, which is synergism of the soft and tender X-ray microscopy beamlines. And then the main technology is in that beamline is a scanning transmission X-ray microscopy. We usually call it STXM. So I want to give a brief introduction of what is STXM. So STXM can generate a stack of image at different energies with high energy resolution. And then each pixel of this image contains the information of transmitted intensity when the sample is interacting with those X-ray beams. And by analyzing those stack of image, we can extract the spectra of the specific elements, which contain the information of the oxidation stage or coordination bonding or the overall the phase or mineralogy of those specific elements. By analyzing those spectra and then the image, we can map the sample area by creating the chemical map, which compose of the elementary compositions or the speciation. The map is containing different speciation of the specific elements of the interest. there is a 3 beamlines that the SIS is supporting. One is the beamline 5322, which is more focused on the soft material like carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. So it's really good for measurement of the organics. And there is two other beamlines, 7012 and 11022. And especially for 7012 is specialized for the typography, which means that the spatial resolution can go down to 15 nanometer. So we can get information of the phase and also the better spatial resolution for specific samples. So as a SIS beamline scientist, my role is conduct my own research by using those facility. Also, the support the user for their use of the synchrotron sources for their earth and environmental science research. So today I'm going to share one of my research. They use the synchrotron techniques and including those STXM data. So now we are changing a view. So many of you heard about the news about the disastrous wildfire that happened in recent decades. And then one of the example is that the Australian bushfire, which lasts over 6 months, and it burns the millions of acres, and it affects the billions of the animals that are living in Australia. At the end, it affects like over 30% of population in Australian population in the long and the short term in terms of the productivity of the forest as well as the health risk. Not only in Australia, that is very common to having a disastrous the wildfire in the Western United States. You may heard about the recent wildfire in the Palisades, in the Eaton fire that happened in LA, which lasted 24 days. And then there was a lot of deaths was happening because it was beyond the forest. It also burned the residential area. So when we're thinking about the wildfire, we usually have a concept of it's disastrous, it's a natural disaster. But wildfire is not a stranger, and it is the most basic and ongoing natural process on the earth. Actually, the low-intensity wildfire have a benefit effect to the ecological society. So the low-intensity wildfire usually burns the vegetation at low temperature. It generates the pyrogenic organic carbon, which is very nutritious for the regrowth of the plants or regeneration of the microbiology community. And it also removes the pest or disease organic matter, so it clears the forest floor, and which will also have the regeneration of the forest. And the low burn severity fire doesn't necessarily destroy the roots or trunk, so the forest can remain intact. And by reducing the crowded vegetation can also prevent the disastrous wildfire, which can last very long with a high intensity. So what is the problem of the high severity wildfire? Usually the high burn soil generate the pyrogenic organic carbon, which is tends to have an aromatic ring. It's hard to be used for the microbes or the plants, and it will prevent the regrowth of the plants or microbes. And because of the loss of a lot of important nutrients, including the organic carbon, it's actually prevent the regeneration of native plants or native microbes. So usually you can see after the wildfire, the lands become more covered by the bush rather than the original plants that used to be there. It's also because the high intensity wildfire weakened the roots or the trunk. So those the native plants, it's just fully destroyed, which is also bad not only for the ecological regeneration perspective, it also can incur the erosion problem. So what is the difference in the recent wildfire? The difference of the recent wildfire compared to the exist wildfire is the high frequency. We can see the increase of frequency over decades, and also the high burning severity. So high burning severity means once the fire is ignited, it burns more area than it used to be. So you can also see from this graph, the burning area is increased over time. We can also see by using this map. The map in the right side is showing the burn area during between 1970 and 1980. You can clearly see after 3 decades that the burn area clearly increased. That the burn area between 2010 and 2020 is much larger compared to the burn area 3 decades ago. So we can clearly see this is a problem. The recent wildfire is disastrous, but we need to know why. So one of the main reasons is climate change. With increase of the temperature, the drier and warmer condition catalyze the wildfire. And once the wildfires happen, it's very hard to extinguish because the condition is very dry. There is no moisture around, so the fire usually lasts longer. And this effect will become larger and larger because the temperature of the earth becomes higher and higher. The other main factor of the wildfire, the disaster wildfire, is the known the land management. Once the small fire is ignited, the people try to suppress the wildfire and to use this land for the different purposes like industry or the agriculture. So this suppress of the wildfire can generate more fuel. So once the fire is happened, there is more fuel to burn, so it's very difficult to stop. So those high intensity wildfire will increase continuously and will have a serious consequences, not only for the ecological system, but also the human society. So one of the main consequences of the wildfire is ash deposition. So what is ash? The ash is the burned vegetation that containing organic or inorganic composites. The average ash thickness once the wildfire happens, it can be varied between 5 to 50 millimeters, and the fuel loading, the ash loading, can be different from the 10 to 200 tons per hectare. Deposition of ash have a serious impact in the soil chemistry because it changed the elemental composition and the speciation of the surface soil. So it's very important to understand the molecular scale elemental changes in the burned soil and vegetation to understand the below ground biogeochemistry after the wildfire. So first, we wanted to know what is the general chemistry of the ash. Usually, ash is composed of some fraction of the organics, silicate, or metal oxide, and then the carbonate minerals. So the organic carbon can be composed up to 50%, especially low intensity fire, that the temperature of the fire lower than 450 Celsius. And you can see when we compare the organic carbon between the unburned, not recently experienced the soil and then the ash, the concentration is more or less comparable. But the difference of the organic carbon in the wildfire ash is their chemistry. So when the fire have a low temperature, it generates pyrogenic organic carbon, which is very nutritious, containing the different types of carboxyl acid or the amine groups, so which can be benefit for the ecological system. But when the fire temperature got increased, those organic compounds can be converted to the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon, which is known as a carcinogenic, as well as their metabolites is considered as the toxic organic species. Not only that, in general, the high temperature wildfire generate the organic compounds with a high aromatic group, which is more difficult to breaking down for the microbe and the plants. And also it reduced the C-N ratio by generating the CO2 gas, which will also affect the nutrition cycle after wildfire. The other major components of the wildfire ash is inorganic compounds. So when the fire temperature increase more than 450 degrees, the most of the organic species will convert it to going to the mineralization process to create the carbonate or CO2 minerals. So the carbonate affection can be the large as more than 50%. And those carbonate and the mix with a different kind of alkaline metal species can contribute to the high pH of the ash chemistry, ash suspension. And as you can see from those graphs, the ash pH is usually 3 units higher than the normal acidic or neutral forest soil. So usually the inorganic fraction of the wildfire ash consists of metal oxide like calcium oxide, magnesium, potassium, as well as a redox active iron or manganese hydroxide. And also that it also contains a large amount of silicate and then carbonates. And usually various geogenic contaminants like chromium, arsenic, rhenium, or mercury is associated with those metal species, which means their reactivity or the stability will be different before or after the wildfire. There is actually several research that focus on the behavior of the geogenic contaminants after wildfire. For example, under combustion, the condition, which means oxygen-rich burning situation, that make the chromium-6 transform to the chromium-6. Chromium-3 transform to the chromium-6, which is more toxic and more labile. In the pyrolysis environment, which means in the absence of oxygen, the burning, the vegetation or soil can make the mercury 2 to become the mercury 0, which is volatile, which will be very harmful for not only the ecological system, but also the human health. But how about the micronutrients like iron or manganese? So far, there is not so much information about their composition, minerality, and reactivity of iron and manganese in the ash, and then what is their implication in terms of nutrition cycle after post-fire. So first, we may wanted to know that the common iron and manganese species, like common iron manganese species, we can think about goethite or 2-line ferrihydrite or the hematite as iron 3 minerals under oxide conditions. And the other common species of the manganese will be a bernesite, which is manganese 4 minerals. So we wanted to know how the wildfire will change those the elemental concentration and speciation and reactivity. So as a study site, it's not what we picked. It happened to be a glass fire, and we collect the different types of ash sample or unburned or the reference sample from the glass fire that happened in 2020. It was also one of the disastrous fire. It burned the large amount of acres, and it lasts almost 1 month. And it also burned a lot of forest and also the residential area. The interesting thing about those fire, the severity of the fire was mixed. It was mixed between the moderate burn severity and then the high burn severity. So when when we were talking about the moderate burn severity or high burn severity, that is defined as the high burn severity means that the burn area, the mortality of the tree is more than 80%. For the moderate burn severity means the mortality of the tree and vegetation is between 30 to 80%. So it's not so much about the temperature, it's more about how much it burns. So this is the site where we collect the sample. We collect the different the ash sample at different elevation and the vegetation. And you can see the 3 of those sites was highly burnt based on the bare map, as well as we can also looking at the ice. And there is a 4th site which experience moderate burn severity. We also collect the sample after 2 years of these wildfire events in the similar location. And as you can see that in terms of vegetation, that we are looking at more like a bush types of vegetation rather than the native plants that were used to be there. So what we did with those ash particles. So for the ash, we collected like almost up to 1 centimeter of the from the surface. We obtained the ash above 1 centimeter from the ground. And then for the surface soil and unburned soil, we try to collect around 5 centimeter below the surface. For the characterization, we use a wet chemical method to measure pH, EH, and POC. And then we also observe the dissolution kinetics of the iron and manganese from the ash chemistry. And we also did a lot of solid characterization using scanning X-ray transmission microscopy for the organic and calcium, iron, and manganese map. Also, we did a lot of X-ray absorption spectroscopy imaging for the iron and manganese speciation. Also to looking at the relationship with the other types of elements. Okay, so this is actually the first result that I'm showing. First, we need to know about their concentration. So those the bar graph is showing the 3 different types of sample. The green is unburned all the time. The red is the ash that is collected 3 days after the wildfire. And the orange is the surface soil that is collected 2 years after burn. And you can see that for iron, their concentration is more or less similar. So wildfire does not enrich the iron concentration in ash. However, for manganese, you can see the manganese concentration in the ash is much more higher compared to the unburned soil or the surface soil that we collected 2 years after. We can see from those maps. So the upper map is the thin section microprobe the imaging analysis result that is showing the iron distribution in the map and then the manganese distribution in the sample. You can see in the same location, iron is more located as an aggregated form. It feels like they are coming from the soil. And then the manganese species more highly distributed, and then they exist as a fine particle. Is kind of showing that the manganese is coming from in the ash. The manganese coming from the burning the vegetation. It stays as a very fine particle. And there is an outlier in the manganese concentration. It actually that is coming from the S4 sample, which experienced the low the burn severity, the moderate burn severity. It also indicated that manganese may coming from the vegetation rather than the soil, because the concentration of manganese from the low burn severity sample is the lowest. So what is the relationship of those elements with the different the species? So when this is actually the STXM result, and this is a tricolor elemental map, is showing where the carbon and manganese and iron exist. So by looking at here, what we can see is that actually the manganese and then the iron does not coexist. There is no chemical association, or their location does not overlap. It's showing that their sources might be different. When we're looking at the carbon, calcium, iron map, and then related to those the manganese map, where the manganese is stayed is the states where the calcium stays, which is one of the primary elements that we obtain from the vegetation. So from here, we can also think about we can estimate the manganese may coming from the vegetation primarily, and then the source of iron must be different. We can confirm this one by using a different type of elemental map. This is actually obtained by the Stanford synchrotron light source. It's a different dim9 at dim923. It's a microprobe X-ray fluorescence. The analysis is showing the tricolor elemental map of iron, silicate, aluminum. So we recognize that the silicate aluminum is representative of the soil minerals. And we can see the clear chemical association with the aluminum and iron and the silica. It's indicating that the source of the iron is primarily the soil rather than the vegetation. Of course, we should not exclude the iron source from the vegetation because of the dust or the nutritional role of the iron in the plants. And as you can see from the manganese, that the manganese have a highly relation with the sulfur or the potassium, which can be most likely driven from the plant-related materials. So from this result, what we can conclude is that wildfire can increase the concentration of manganese that is coming from the vegetation. However, it does not necessarily enrich the iron concentration. So maybe it does not enrich the iron concentration, but it does not mean that it will not affect their speciation. So now we are going to looking at the speciation of the iron from unburned soil and ash and 2 years after fire. So this is the iron gene spectra from the unburned soil, and the unburned soil 1 and 2 is containing a bit of the leader sample, the leader species, and the unburned 3 and then 4, it's more like a downside of the soil, so it does not necessarily contains a lot of leader, the fresh leader sample. From those, the analysis, we can find the iron species based on the linear combination fitting with a known iron reference. We can conclude that those unburned sample is mostly composed with a 2-line ferrihydrite or the hematite feature. We usually expect there will be a goethite in the soil, but actually based on the target transformation analysis and as they're fitting, we did not necessarily find a goethite feature in this specific soil. Then what about the ash chemistry? We were noticed that there is a little hump here at before the iron ash is occurring. And then when we are analyzing those spectra with a known the iron reference, we recognize there is a more maghemite feature is found. And this is not necessarily very new because there is some laboratory study have found when you are burn the ferrihydrite or goethite in the organic rich condition that you form the maghemite. So you can see that the ash actually changed the iron geochemistry by forming new different types of mineral that is not necessarily so common in the soil environment. So we can see that the decrease of the fraction of the ferrihydrite and the increase of fraction of hematite, and then the new the mineral is formed in the ash composite. So now we can zoom in where actually those species is. So this is the elemental map. And then this individual number is showing that where we took the microdane data for looking at the specific iron species at different locations. In general, those microdane data was agree on the Berg Jane data, which is this is the Berg iron Jane data. But what we have found is that we found very little amount of hematite and then the more larger fraction of the maghemite. We were curious about why we found those the differences between the Berg and then the point Jane. So when we pick those positions, we were trying to pick the position where there is a manganese enriched. So which meaning that where the iron is close to manganese, which is coming from the vegetation, there might be the area is more organic rich. And we already know that the maghemite is formed under same condition, but when the organic concentration, the surrounding organic concentration is high. So we are hypothesizing that the reason that we found the more maghematite in the microzone region is because of those location have a more organic compound than the other the sites. So those are the high burn severity sample, just to remember. And this is coming from the low moderate burn severity, moderate burn sample, which is the S4. And you can immediately notice that actually the iron species is more diversified on the low temperature burned the wildfire ash sample. So this indicating actually the wildfire can diversify the iron species in the soil environments, and the microzone can actually capture that the species that we are not able to capture in the bird chemistry. So now we are curious, after 2 years of time, what would be the ash chemistry? Would the ash will be remain there, or there will be or went away, or what kind of mineral transformation may happen during these 2 years? So we went back to the site and collect the soil, the surface soil sample, and measure the iron K spectra, and then we found that actually the surface soil went back to the condition where we uptake the sample that before the wildfire. So it tells that in 2 years the ash may disappear by the wind, or it run away because of the precipitation reaction, or it can be incorporated to the deeper soil parts. So in the surface soil chemistry, the iron chemistry come back after 2 years after the wildfire. So what we can learn from here is that wildfire can transform iron into more crystalline phase, which means that the nutrition uptake strategy may be changing. It's more difficult to get the iron as a nutrient because their solubility is higher at high alkaline pH, and also the iron itself become more crystalline, indicating the microbe or plants need to develop different types of strategies to obtain the iron as a nutrient. And we also find that after 2 years post-fire, the iron species went back to the previous iron species, which indicating those species went through the different types of mineral transformation reaction, or physically they run out because of the precipitation events or the wind effect. So now we are going to looking at the manganese species. So manganese, I actually did not put any guide bar because the difference is so obvious. You can see that the unburned sample from the containing liter that have a more feature at the manganese 2 and 3 peak area. And then the soil sample is basically more or less identical with the delta-2 manganese 4 minerals that is common manganese species in the soils. So we can see from the unburned sample have a high manganese 3 organic content, including manganese 2 species. And then the unburned soil sample is containing the manganese 4 minerals is a common manganese species in the environment. When those samples experience of the wildfire, we can see all of the peak is changing, indicating that there is a new manganese species it has been formed. You can see the decrease of the manganese organic composite by the burning of the organic species, and increase of the hausmannite species, which is manganese 2, 3 minerals. And it's more crystalline minerals than the manganese 4 or manganese 2 the species. And then also the decrease of manganese 2 species. So from here, we can learn that wildfire crystalline the manganese species, also introduce the new species that is not necessarily exist in the current environment, because For example, hausmannite usually generate in the hydrothermal events with a high amount of heat as well as a high amount of the pressure, which is not necessarily common in the natural environment. In the sample, we also measure the different types of we also use the different types of technique to looking at the manganese species. So this is a result of the manganese multi-energy map. So by obtaining different types of gene and then using a PCA analysis and then the cluster analysis, we can obtain the manganese map for the different species at the different sample locations. So you can see that here I show the tricolor map of the delta-amino-2, hausmannite, and manganese organics. You can see the delta-amino-2 that is more discrete particles that more happen in the aggregated form, the aggregated fine particle. Rather, the manganese-3 organic composite is widely dispersed, as if they are coming from the vegetation that are fine particle after it experienced the burn. And you can also see the hausmannite, which is crystalline particle, is more stay as on their own. So this is a cool technique that you can see the looking at the different speciation and their morphology and how those speciation is related to the different elements surrounded in this environment. So how about the manganese species after 2 years of wildfire? You can see the quality of the spectra is a little bit poor compared to the Burke analysis, when we compare to the Burke analysis. Actually, this is not a Burke manganese K as vein. It's actually we obtained from the microgene data where the manganese concentrate is very small because we are not able to get a time at the Burke for the manganese species. And you can, still we were able to do the feeding process and we find it out. Some of the manganese species came back. Before the wildfire, we can see the increase of the delta-amino-2 species after 2 years. Also that the increase of the manganese-3 organic composite is increased because of the later deposition after the fire events. And then we are not able to observe any the feature of the hausmannite in this the sample. So what we learned from looking at the manganese chemistry, so in the pre-fire condition, the known manganese species is manganese-4 minerals, that is a layered structure, the manganese-4 minerals, but they went through different types of reaction, dehydration, crystallization, and thermal oxidation reduction reaction, creating different types of manganese species, including manganese-3 or hausmannite or manganese-3 organic composite. So this indicates wildfire diversify the manganese species in the soil conditions. Would it be the good effects? We don't actually know. What would the impact of those introduce of those iron and manganese species in their bioavailability? So we were looking at their mobility by using a pyrobirding, which is the biogenic ligand. Usually exuded by the microorganism when they are experiencing the iron deficient condition. So, but those pyrobirding had affinity for iron and manganese, more or less same degree. So we use a pyrobirding looking at the reactivity of iron and manganese in the ash and soil, and then the soil after the wildfire. As you can see, well, you may remember the concentration of the iron of those 3 types of sample were quite similar. But now we see the different reactivity. The ash was having a higher the iron mobility compared to the unburned sample. But we may question that, well, the wildfire actually crystallized iron species. So we should not able to get the high iron solubility. So we were curious about it, why we have a more iron solubility in those samples. I think one of the reasons is that the surface area of where the iron containing ash must be more finer than the soil. That would be the first the region. The other is Actually, the wildfire ash, when we are suspended in the water system, the total dissolved organic carbon concentration is much higher compared to those concentration in the unburned soil or 2 years after the fire. So those total organic matter can interplay with the pyro burden and then increase the iron solubility. So how about the manganese? Manganese chemistry is the more interesting actually. So I think in terms of the concentration, the mobilized manganese concentration is much higher in ash, which makes sense because there is a more manganese species in the ash chemistry, in the ash than the unburned soil or 2 years after post-fire surface soil. However, their mobilization trend is different. Once the manganese is mobilized from ash, they stay more or less constant. However, the manganese mobilized from the unburned soil or 2 years after fire, they reach the maximum condition and decrease. And we think that it's because of the changes of the differences of the manganese species. As you can see from this empty circle, this is from the manganese, which is manganese-3 minerals. And you can see the mobilized manganese manganese-3 concentration stay as it is, which is very similar in the ash manganese chemistry. But while from when we do this dissolution experiment with the bernicite, it reached the maximum concentration and decrease over time. It's because the delta amino2 have a high redox potential, which can destroy the manganese organic, the composite, which is mobile. So this is telling that the ash is containing more manganese-3 composite, which is the manganese-3 organics or the hausmannite. That is telling that the most of manganese-3 then mobilized by the pyro burden is intact from this situation. However, the soil that containing the redox active delta amino2 is actually reactive towards the manganese-3 pyro burden complex and decrease their mobility over time. So this tells that wildfire is actually changed their crystallinity of the iron and manganese, also changed their reactivity or when they are reacting with poor water or when they are experiencing with the precipitation events. So what we can learn from this work, we can see that ash had a distinct chemistry compared to the soil. They are not experienced the recent wildfire, because we should not just assume that they never experienced the wildfire. pH of the ash suspension usually 2 to 3 units higher of the soil suspension pH. And there is a minimal differences in the concentration of the iron. So we can learn that ash, the wildfire does not enrich the iron concentration, but it reached the manganese concentration, which is coming from the vegetation primarily. Wildfire transformed the iron into more crystalline iron 3 hydroxide mineral like a manganite or hematite. And wildfire also introduced a new manganese species into the soil environment that does not exist before. And those changes of the mineralogy and then the speciation is actually affecting their bioavailability after fire, which will affect the regeneration, the rate of the microbe or the plants in overall ecological biogeochemical systems. However, we learned after 2 years, when we learned that by analyzing the 2 years after surface sample, the new phases does not remain permanently, and it usually washed away or incorporate to the deeper soil. So it is important to looking at biogeochemistry in a more short term, how those weathering process is affecting the short-term biogeochemistry. Or we also need to looking at the more deeper side of the soil when the ash is actually incorporated to the deeper side of the soil, how their chemistry is changing in the longer time period. So with that, this is actually me taking a sample with my previous PI. I would like to thank everyone who listened to my presentation and happy to take any questions. So maybe Mhm. Mhm.
And I was just curious if there are other things that move or any instrument. If this material moves offsite because of wind.
Yeah, exactly. So there is the one thing that actually I didn't mention. We should not only looking at the soil side, we also need to looking at the airborne material, but we also need to looking at nearby watershed. Because when those wildfire ash experience the precipitation after the fire, and it usually run out to the nearby water stream, and it actually increase the total organic carbon concentration as well as the metal contaminants concentration. So in a short and long term, that we also need to consider about the toxicity of those metal species in the nearby environment. So we may wanted to looking at the water chemistry in a short and a long term, how those concentration varied over time. Would they stay as it is, or would they decrease over time? Actually, there is a research about it, and they take a sample over 5 years of time, and actually some of the concentration of the iron or chromium, those species will stay as a high after the fire events during 5 years of the investigation. So the impact can be larger. Yeah, we cannot just assume that, oh, it went away, so we're done. And actually wildfire is okay, but that's not true.
I was curious to what extent your conclusions are sensitive to their site or event.
Yeah, those like in general, those ash chemistry is affected by the different types of components, like a fuel type, what kind of vegetation was that, and also the wind condition or oxygen conditions. So it can be maybe happen in the general in this specific site, but we can think that we can also kind of generalize that by looking at other laboratory types of experience, that some people, we were just taking an ash sample here, but some people take the soil sample and burn in some wildfire conditions, and then they also found some crystalline iron minerals, but there was no study about the manganese itself. But by looking at that, we can kind of generalize wildfire can create the crystalline, the redox-sensitive minerals, but maybe the degree of the fraction of the hematite or maghemite, or there might be there also possibility that the magnetite can be generated during the wildfire. So those fractions can be different.
Oh, thanks for great presentation. So I was really struck by this the increase of the iron crystallinity with a wildfire, but then it's kind of so deep, right? In
Yeah.
2 years, then kind of come back to normal. So I was curious about what the long-term impact of the wildfires on the soil iron and then this associated carbon cycle.
In the I think in the long term, that's so those regeneration process after wildfire will experience different conditions now and then 1 year later or 2 years later, because those regeneration process will happen more warmer and more drier conditions. So now we see that there is a precipitation event, and so it went away from on the sites. But maybe in the long term, that once the fire is happen again, if it's drier and it's warmer, their transformation, the weathering reaction and their kinetic will be different. And then if they are staying or incorporate to the deeper soil, the effects of those redox active elements will be not just not in the short term, but it will affect the organic cycle in a long term, in the more the bottom of the surface, not bottom of the surface, more lower surface side. So I don't actually know that much about what would be those fire events in like 10 years later, but this is something that we need to look into. And there's actually research is happening. I think it's happening in the Lawrence Berkeley lab. And then there is a site, and we artificially burn the sample, burn the whole area. And then we are actually looking at their regeneration in much warmer or much colder conditions. So that research is going on. But I can imagine there must be a long-term effect in terms of the carbon chemistry. Actually, I was not talking about the carbon chemistry, but we don't actually know yet whether the carbon went back to the normal species or not. So that's something that we also need to look at.
Question. I was wondering if you could speak on anything about, like if you had more severe fire, expect to also see these kinds of results, or would it differ at all? I think you mentioned that then you're doing sort of different burning experiments. That's something that you anticipate would sort of change with maybe?
Yes, for example, that's more severe fire. Based on the lab experiments, we may not able to see, for example, burning site. Because based on the lab experiment, which the burn temperature is over 500 degrees, the burning site structure just collapsed. That has been already proven. And for the iron sites, now we were looking at we were observing the different hematite and maghemite fraction. But actually, the maghemite is formed more organic rich condition, and the temperature is lower than 450 degrees. But with increase of the temperature, no matter there is organic or not, but of course, then in this temperature, all the organic will be burned away. The maghemite will be more crystalline, and then it will be converted to the hematite. So the fraction of the mineral will be changed depending on the burn temperature.
I also have a question related to what we asked, if the type of forest also impact here and maybe moderate fire. Because it may be higher to say 450 degrees, that could be similar somewhat. But I would think, for example, if your study was in temperate forest, like if there is some studies related to more tropical forest, or because they have different component of species that might be enriched, like enriched soil with manganese.
Yeah, I think so too. Like depending on the types of soil, for example, like tropical soil may have a more moisture content, and then more different types of vegetation. It will affect the different changes of those iron and manganese species. This is more like the Mediterranean types of conifer, or the chaparral and then bush types of the forest. So those particular results may not relate to the tropical types of soil. Okay.
Do you see online if there are any questions?
In the chat, there is no question currently.
Any other questions in the room? Well, let's thank our speaker again. Randy had to give a test for her class.
So shall I stop share?
Yeah.
Yeah.